My hope is that people will move away from the possible feelings of shame that surround mental health, struggle, emotional, pain. I think culturally, our instinctual response is to run from that pain. And I want to invite people into realizing that, in fact, it's not shameful to go there. It is necessary.
Welcome to the Dealing with Feelings webcast. Today I spoke with Dr. Jenny Wang, a Houston-based licensed psychologist and author of a fantastic book called Permission to Come Home. Jenny takes a cultural approach to helping her clients with their mental health and wellness, and has done incredible work supporting Asian Americans in particular. I love learning all the ways she blends Eastern and Western culture with the teaching of emotion regulation. Lots of things to think about and apply. Let's get into it now. Welcome, Jenny. Great to see you.
Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So as I've shared with you, this series is called Dealing with Feelings. And I'm excited to speak with you about your work as a clinician, doing this work with people, where you are. And of course, though, I have to start off with my question, which is, how are you feeling?
I am feeling, to be honest, somewhat disoriented. I just flew back from Asia on Sunday, so I'm quite jet lagged. And you were talking about being up early. I've been up since probably 4 a.m. today.
Okay.
So I think I'm trying to find grounding even as I'm sitting here with you, as I'm kind of looking at you, even using you as a source of grounding. So that's where I am. I just had to be honest.
So I thought it would be good to just, I'm always interested in how people decide to do what they do. Everybody has a story. And I'm just really curious. I've read your book called Permission to Come Home. We'll talk about that, of course. But how did you end up becoming a psychologist?
Well, as I share in my book, I was supposed to be an accountant. And so there was this very kind of defining moment when I took Psych 101 and was kind of like, oh, a light bulb went off. Like, people actually do this as a career. People actually get to be with people in such an intimate way. And I think at that point, I couldn't not pursue the field. It was almost like this fire was ignited. And so I dropped out of a 5-year master's accounting program. I changed my major at that point to finance so I could make space for psychology and prereqs. And it was a very clear departure. It was, I'm choosing this. And being an eldest daughter, child of immigrants, this idea of choosing for myself is kind of foreign. It was foreign at that time of my life. And so pursuing psychology became this thing that I just knew I had to do. And I think there was this thought that human connection and human presence could be so powerful and healing. And I wanted to see what that was like.
Neat. Love that. And so you've gotten into, obviously treating people and working with people. And this series is about emotion regulation. And I'm just curious, in the practice that you have, in the speaking that you do, and the work that you do, how much of a need have you found there to be in this area of emotion regulation?
Oh, I would say it's there in every facet of my life, as a psychologist, but as a mom, as a partner. It is, and this is why in my book, Permission to Feel is chapter 2, because I kind of see it as the foundation for all other psychological work. And when we invite people into deep therapy work or into handling conflict, if emotion regulation is a skill that's underdeveloped, we don't have the tolerance to handle everything that this stirs up. So I think as a clinician, I use it every day because people come into session with such heavy and heartbreaking things. And let's not be naive. We're affected as a clinician, right? You feel their pain because you care so deeply for your clients. And so I'm constantly in a state of checking in, regulating so that my counter reactions don't also enter the therapy space, So it is crucial. And we could talk about this all day. So
I'm sure.
I'm going to stop there.
No, good. And I just want to take you or ask you to take us a little deeper into, your work on emotion regulation and treating people. From what I've gathered, you mostly treat Asian Americans.
That's a big part of my practice now, or individuals of color. Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes people think of emotion regulation as like you just take a deep breath, or you think positively. And obviously, we both know it's much deeper than that. And I'm just curious how identity plays into this, given that you work with specific populations.
I think that this idea of emotion regulation is laden with the socialization that we have, right? And I see it in our older generation of Asian Americans, my parents, my grandparents, where in their minds, emotion regulation is actually more like stoicism. It is a steely, suppressing like expression. And for them, having seen poverty, war, trauma, and not having solutions that necessarily were very tangible to them, that suppression, that stoicism was seen as a way to cope. And to say it's good or bad, I don't know that it's good or bad. It was what was available to them, right? And so I think culturally that stoicism then was something we witnessed as children, right? My dad, I don't think I saw him cry until last year for the first time. And in that, I think that stoicism, that kind of steely demeanor was how they cared for others too. Because they will say, I don't want to let my emotions overwhelm you, right? I don't want to make you feel overwhelmed with my emotional life. So that was how they had framed that idea. And I think for me, it wasn't until I started my training and learning about emotions that it was like, oh, there's another way to do this too, right? And there's a way to feel it without necessarily being completely overwhelmed by our emotions. And that, as you write beautifully in your book, that the emotions are data, right? And if I lock away that emotional life, I'm losing out on so much of that data. And I think that's what we're trying to teach clients.
So you're bringing in kind of one aspect of kind of people's experience, which was kind of where they came from and whatever wars they were having or whatever cultural, things they were bringing to the picture. It's interesting because we do work all over the globe, and I get that question all the time. Like, how much are you going to differentiate, your approach to the schools in Italy or Spain or China or Taiwan and I find that there are obviously nuances, in terms of like what emotions are more expressed or less expressed.
Yeah.
But I've always struggled with this, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this around like it, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong or right, which is asking people like, is how you're dealing with your feelings working for you to have good health, to have good well-being? Because it's always uncomfortable for me to go into another country or a culture and be the knower. I don't want to be that person. How do you acknowledge culture, sometimes challenge culture? I know you do that in your book because you, coming from where you're from, your family background in Taiwan, some of the rules that you talked about, around emotion, you're like, wait a minute, I'm not sure those rules work for me.
Absolutely. I think it's a delicate practice, right? Because you're saying, well, how is this coping strategy working? How effective? And I would say that coping doesn't really have a morality. It's not good or bad. It's more efficacious or maybe less, or more promoting of well-being than other strategies, right? And I think as human beings, we utilize the strategies that are most available to us, And so I think that question that you shared of how well is it working is a strategy that I do ask my clients. And I say, my goal is not to remove your previous coping strategies because they got you this far, right? But my goal is to introduce additional options. and also a sense of discernment as to when to use these variety of coping strategies that you have available to you. And often I think we go into this almost as a learner mind with our clients, right? Because I do not know their full experience. And those coping strategies evolve for a reason. And so for me to say, oh, that's not as effective, or you should get rid of that. I mean, that's not right our role here, but is to invite our clients to question for themselves. Could I possibly do this differently?
In our school-based work, we work with a lot of high schools, and, students right now in my interviews with them are I had challenges as a kid growing up dealing with my feelings, but I wasn't so much worried about climate change, school shootings. The list goes on in terms of what students say they're like is kind of, causing them stress and overwhelm and angst. And I'm just curious, from all of the work that you've done, what do you think are the top strategies, right? Like that are, obviously there's a million strategies, but have you noticed in your practice, like there's 3 or 4 that just really, are helpful?
I think that one of the most important things that we try to impart to our clients is a sense of agency or control, right? Self-efficacy in the world that is quite scary to young people and adults alike, right? And so I think that is always something that at the end of the day or at the end of the session, we're trying to formulate what are the choices and what are the actions that you can take today. And I'll frame them as micro actions, right? Because sometimes the action is quite large and overwhelming, and the likelihood of actually doing it is very low because of that. So for some clients, maybe they're trying to set better boundaries with family members. And it's hard because in their family dynamics or in their culture, it's not acceptable. It's not okay to say no. And so we always start with, well, what is the thing you do want to say? Or what is the boundary that you want to impart? And now let's back it down 50%. Let's back it down another 50, right? Let's bring it down to a point where you could actually do that today. And maybe today's micro action is starting to think about the language that you'll use when your mother starts making comments about your body during the holidays. And we start to then develop the language. And that's doable because they feel safe, right? And that's one of the things that I think we're trying to titrate, especially with emotion regulation, is we don't want to send people out into the world to be totally overwhelmed by the actions that they take because they'll never go there again, right? So by titrating it down and developing micro actions, they experience mini or micro success too. And then they build and build towards their desired goal.
So what I'm also hearing from you is kind of something that I really think is important, which is a prevention mindset. Mm-hmm. That if you can anticipate, that's right, like your mother being a trigger for you, then think in advance, if she's going to make the comment or she's going to say something that's going to be, annoying or irritating. Can you put yourself, can you have your toolkit or your tool, ready to support you in not getting so activated?
Absolutely. And I think if we think about kind of the top areas that you were asking about, I think prevention is part of that list, right? Because when we're living in survival or distress, prevention feels like worlds away, right? And so once the client starts to feel a little bit more grounded, a little bit more confident, right? And less overwhelmed perhaps by the constant stressors, then we do need to start orienting towards how do we prepare you now for situations that we've talked about in the past that has caused distress, but prepare you for now the next encounter where you can enter with a sense of competency and confidence now. And so I think the self-efficacy is huge. I agree with you. I think prevention is half the battle, because those emotions then might not surge to that level of overwhelm when you're feeling equipped.
If you don't mind, I'm going to do a little role play with you.
Yeah.
So let's imagine, because this is something that I get asked all the time, and I have my way of answering it, but I'm really curious to see others. So, like the high schooler comes home from school, they're like, I can't take it anymore. This is happening and that's happening and this is happening. And like, I just can't take it anymore. And the parents just freak out in that moment, or partners freak out in that moment. And so when you're faced with that kind of like energy, what are your recommendations for how to be supportive and how to help people not be so escalated?
And I feel this so deeply because I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they feel all the feels, right? And I think you're right. Half the battle, as a parent, is our own anxiety, our own fears about what this means when my child comes home and they're just like, I'm done with all of this. I quit it all, right? That actually activates our own anxieties, so much so that it sometimes clouds our ability to be supportive. And so I think sometimes if that were to be the case, where I had a high schooler, they came home and they were just so overwhelmed, I think there's something so powerful about just even physical presence. Shutting the phone off, turning off the stove, forgetting the laundry, orienting your body and mind first to your child, right? Because nowadays we live lives that are so busy that real presence with another human being is actually quite rare, even for our loved ones, as much as we try. And so first step would be clearing the entire schedule for yourself so that you could truly be present.
I have a little phrase, you got to deactivate to co-regulate, and that I know when I was growing up, I was that kid because I was bullied and I hated school, and I would come home and be like, and my mother got triggered by it, because she didn't have the self-regulation skills. And so the answer was like, who do you think you are talking to me that way? And so that it's funny you say that too, because, I do work with families a lot, as you might. And, if you have a workshop that says, how to be an emotionally intelligent parent, 10 people show up. But if you have one that says how to raise an emotionally intelligent kid who's going to get into an Ivy League university, everybody shows.
That's right.
And look, I think the adults forget that there's work to be done on themselves.
Yes. And I find that a lot of my clients pursue therapy for the first time when they're about to have their first child, or when they're starting to hit some struggles with raising children, right? And we expect that to happen. And there's always a sense of, I'm here to help them. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, we're here to grow you, right? So that you have the skills. And I think as a parent, we will model responses to stressors for our kids. And I don't expect parents to be these perfectly regulated adults all the time, right? But we show our kids what is the range of response that can happen when work is very stressful, or when we fight with our partners, right, in front of our children. My partner and I have done that before, and our kids will be like, is everything okay? And I also try my best not to candy coat our lives and our marriage, because our kids also need to see that there's a tensile strength there, and being able to see that we can get through this and move towards repair, right? Which is one of the most important pieces. And so to answer your question, I think the first thing is regulating ourselves, right? And then when we meet our children, it is them taking the lead. I have one child who could talk all day. They write dissertations on how they feel. And my other child clams up just doesn't want to talk. And so part of it is you start to learn what your child needs in those moments of distress. And it could be totally different right across them. And so one is, can I meet them in the place, in the context that they are needing right now? And honestly, and I would say this probably applies to adults too, when we are so dysregulated, I find words to kind of be not quite effective. You can say all the things, you can provide the verbal comfort and the affirmation, but at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily honor how hard it feels to them, right? And how big the issue might feel to them. And so sometimes it's even just sitting a little bit closer, asking them, do you want me to hold you? Do you want me to sit next to you? And I think the bodies then also start to vibrate similarly over time, as long as we're regulated.
I'm curious about that now from the cultural perspective, because
Yes.
I know, for example, I've done work in China and Korea and also in Italy, and they're pretty different, in terms of approaching emotion. There's a lot of touch in Italy. There's a lot of kissing and holding and less so, in Asia. Anything you can say about that in terms of how that might play into it?
Generationally, I would say I'm 1.5 generation. I was born in Taiwan, but moved here when I was 2. So I kind of straddle both worlds, kind of my kids being raised perhaps in a more physically affectionate environment that we give to them. And then my parents, where I didn't hug my dad until I was in college for the first time, And so it almost feels like I'm in between those two spheres. And I've found as I've gotten older and seen my parents in a much more three-dimensional way that sometimes either through culture, family dynamics, and upbringing, in cultures where there's less physical touch, sometimes it's actually through parallel process action that we have some of that presence physically. And what I mean by that is, I remember times as a kid where my mom would be shucking the green beans, she'd be like sitting there peeling and all of that. And I remember I would sit down next to her and just kind of start doing the same. We weren't touching, we weren't necessarily very physically close or proximal, but there was something about that co-sharing of a task that was very regulating. And in a lot of cultures, or in Asian culture, or at least in my family, we love through service. We love through cooking for you. We love through telling you that you should eat more. We love through cooking or cutting fruit for you, right? These are those ways that we show we love each other. And people will say they had parents who never said, I love you. But whenever they felt poorly or sad, you would always see like a bowl of beautiful, well-cut fruit sitting next to you, And so there's something about action that I think in some cultures speaks, right, to that resonance. And so sometimes there are times where, my dad, he's out there changing the filter on my car, right? And that's his act of love. And I'll just sit out there with him. And we won't necessarily get into deep conversation or emotional conversation, but even the being alongside feels healing,
Yeah, that's interesting. I appreciate that, because what you're bringing up now, are, well, two factors really. One is the personality factor, like your 2 children who, one, I'm just going to make this up, might be more introverted and the other one might be more extroverted. Personality plays a role. And now you're showing that, love can be with a kiss. It can be with a hug. It can be cutting fruit. It can be just standing by someone and mimicking behaviors or something. So I have a big question for you now, which is one that I've been struggling with. From my perspective, we've had about 35 years or 40 years of science. Like emotional intelligence was coined back in 1990, and then there was a lot of books written on emotional intelligence. People are talking more than ever before about culturally responsive pedagogy, cultural competence in general, but yet the data don't look so good. High school students' well-being, anxiety, depression skyrocketed. Adults' burnout skyrocketed. And so what do you think what's going wrong, and what do we need to do about it from your perspective?
Right. There's obviously something multifactorial going on, and yet those factors are linked, right? But I personally think, especially in our youth, that their exposure to heartbreak, world catastrophe, the problems of this world, they're getting exposed in a way that historically an adult would receive information, right? And I feel that they're not emotionally equipped to be inundated in this way about how, quote unquote, dire the state of the world is. So it's almost like that as they're growing, right, they're getting met earlier and earlier with this type of information. But the skills to handle, the skills to embrace a sense of hopefulness in spite of information about the world is not on pace with what their exposure is. So, right, what happens? We tip towards despair then, right? Or hopelessness when we feel ill-equipped to meet the demands that the world throws at us.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm working on a piece right now with my colleague around this, and what you brought up something that we touched upon, which is, as positive psychology, emotional intelligence became more known and kind of infused into society. At the same time, technology got skyrocketed in terms of, so we're pushing concepts of connection, and meanwhile we're introducing technologies that create disconnection.
Right.
And I think
exactly
technology has moved faster than implementation of well-being approaches in schools and communities, and things of that sort.
I also think that, and this was out of conversations with, I had met the director of spiritual life at USC, and through an event we had done together. And he kind of explored this idea that, in the United States, religion or spirituality is kind of at a decline in a lot of different religious kind of affiliations. And he talked about how this is actually a really unique aspect in American history, whereas initially founded in pretty religious kind of spaces, I guess you could say. And in the most recent few years, we've seen this drop off in people leaving religious, communities in droves, people, moving away from this spiritual life. And he was talking about this idea that it wasn't so much about a specific religion or faith. It's this idea of sacredness in our lives, and how with the loss of some of those kind of ideas and philosophies, we're also losing a sense of sacredness in the way perhaps we live, in the way we interact with each other, and in the way that we see our life in terms of purpose, meaning, mission, right? These bigger ideas. So as all of this is happening and the world feels like it's getting to a darker place, we're also losing connection with these bigger ideas that take us beyond our own lives that we're living. Right?
So like now it's adding, so we have the technology, which is distracting us and obviously bombarding us with content that is not necessarily helpful. And we have a movement towards not being members of groups, where you get the social support systems in that sense of connectedness.
Sense of connectedness, and also like I think one of the questions that human beings often ask is, what am I doing here? Right? What was my purpose here on this earth or in this life? And in the past, people found that meaning making through some of their religious or faith-based philosophies. But as people move away from that, now the question is, well, what is the purpose of my life? Right? And I think those are those existential questions that I think young adults are also grappling with in the context of lots of traumatic world and climate and all of these events,
54-year-olds are doing it too. It's interesting that, it's now I'm getting like activated, mostly because, I spent 25 years, 30 years of my life building programs and approaches and models and bringing them to schools. And, we've been successful. I feel very blessed. At the same time, I look at what's happening in our world and in our own country, like the anger and the division. And I just think to myself, like, is anybody actually, taking this work on emotional intelligence seriously? Do people realize how critical it is to our well-being, to our relationships, to the kind of societal well-being? And it's a struggle. It's a struggle. All right. So I want to segue, because I want to really start learning a little bit more about you, if it's okay. If I were to ask you to create a title for the movie that would describe your emotional development, what would you title the movie?
I think you would have, I'm literally just like word vomiting now, but this is like what came to mind. It was like this idea of like, through the eye of the storm and into the dawn.
All right. It's a cool movie.
Because I think for so long, my emotional life it felt like a storm. It felt like something I could not see through or control or figure out, right? It was just this chaotic space. And then I think now, as I'm a little bit older, right? I think I see a little bit of light now. And I think I can still honor the storm when it comes, but realize that there's always light on the other side.
I've been doing research now for the last 3 years on asking people if they had permission to feel as a child. Did they feel as if they could be their true, full feeling self? And if so, was there a feelings mentor? And so that's my question to you. Do you feel like there was a feelings mentor for you when you were growing up?
That's such an interesting question, because I don't know that I've ever thought of it before, and I write in my book that like my parents modeled two very different styles of emotion regulation or emotional experience, let's say. My dad, as I described, was pretty stoic, and they would have moments where it would just all come out. And then my mom kind of was actually quite emotional, but it was somewhat kind of unboundaried in the sense that I was her therapist. I was her confidant, right? As the eldest daughter, and she didn't have a ton of support. And especially you don't air out dirty laundry about your family to other people. So it stayed within the family, And so my experience was emotions are either really overwhelming because it's a lot and it's getting kind of poured out onto me, or they were something to be suppressed, right, at all costs. And I would say that actually I learned about emotions through friends, honestly. I think through middle school, through high school, I remember having these like, I'd go to a friend's house and we'd pull out our journals and just be like rage writing in our journals about boys or about life or school, what have you. But it felt like a safe space to do all of that, right? Which I didn't necessarily have at home. And so As much as I would have loved to say there was like this adult figure, right, who was able to impart some of these ideas, I actually feel like it was my peers, because it was almost this comfort that none of us knew what we were doing. And we were all just trying to figure it out as we went through life, and we all had our own stories. We all had our own family issues. But this was that safe space that we could go to vent, to talk about it, to problem solve. And being a latchkey kid, I didn't see my parents a ton. They would come home at the end of a long work day and that'd be it. We would have our dinner and we'd go to bed. So my peers ended up being so much more of the contact that I was, receiving. And I would say they were the ones that were my mentors in some ways. And we were kind of the blind leading the blind, but we were in it together.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. What I find in my research, just so you know, and actually I have an interesting cultural piece for this that you'll appreciate, I think, is in the United States, generally speaking, about 30 to 40% of people say they had an Uncle Marvin or an Aunt Maria or, an adult when they were growing up that they felt, they could be their true selves with. That, I call it the feelings mentor. 60% plus say no, which is fascinating to me. Now, recently I had the opportunity to give a talk to Chinese moms, Asian American moms. And I did my survey with them. And so I'm going to ask you to guess what percentage of those moms said that they had a feelings mentor.
I would say less than 50%.
3%.
Oh my, wow. And that doesn't surprise me, but it surprises me because it's much lower than I would have guessed.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. Yeah.
I was just taken aback, and I did that before the presentation. So then the presentation, we could talk through it because I really wanted to understand it. Here's the interesting thing though. It was a large sample. So I had, a couple, maybe 300 or 400. And what I have are data, and I ask people about their life satisfaction, their mental health, their purpose and meaning in life as adults. And what I'm finding is that just at that one question, the yes or no to having the feelings mentor is predictive, of this.
Do you think that having a feelings mentor, it almost like primes you for a different trajectory in terms of your emotional life?
I do. And you know why? What I find is that those who report having had a feelings mentor tend to be higher in extroversion and lower in neuroticism or emotional, and higher in emotional stability. And I've been really, I haven't unpacked this with anybody yet. And so I don't know if it's that the kids who are more outgoing are like, feelings mentor, where are you?
Right.
And so is it like driving the relationship, or is it that having that feelings mentor kind of opened you up to being a little bit freer with your feelings and talking more and feeling more comfortable?
And that makes me wonder, right? How do we train an army of emotion mentors then, right? Like, how do we equip coaches, teachers, I don't know, camp counselors then to be those people that people would identify as their mentors?
And I think there's pushback too, interestingly enough. A lot of parents actually push back. They're like, it's not my job to be my child's feelings mentor because, I've got to push them and get them ready for life. And I can't, that the feelings mentor, their misperception of it is that it's touchy feely, it's soft, it's coddling, not actually teaching evidence-based strategies or, encouraging them, to be more, to be better at dealing with stress, anxiety, et cetera. And so my last series of questions for you are all about you. So you, Jenny wants to feel like just upbeat, excited, happy, just wants to have just be elated, ecstatic. What's your go-to strategy to bring you into the yellow?
has to be movement. Either running, exercise, dancing, running around with my kids, right? Like for me, when my body is in motion, it instantly lifts my mood, no matter how hard of a day I'm having.
Okay, nice. I'm similar to you. I like a lot of movement too. All right, you've seen 1,600 patients. You were like suffocated by all of their challenges. You like feeling hopeless. I'm not helping people. There's no like, how do you get out of that funk?
In those moments, I definitely know my nervous system is like shot, right? It's just done. And so I'm all about nourishment then in that mode. Eating foods that feel very hearty and nourishing, taking a hot bath or a hot shower, like literally when I think about like I'm in like sick mode, right? You know, when you're sick, you start to like cocoon, you start to say no, you start to protect. That's what I do, right? I imagine like curled up on a couch, hot cup of coffee, like I'm not engaging. And I go into my cave and it's a good cave. Like I actually love the cave when I'm in it because I know this is how I'm going to then re-enter the world, right? Without this, I would be ineffective, you know? And so, and I think it took a long time for me to reframe that as I need to go in my cave because can't handle life, right? That's why I'm in my cave, to no, actually the cave is a necessary part. It's like hibernation, right? Yes. So that's that's how I get out of it, is like calming all the senses, calming the nervous system, being with people I love, saying no to all extraneous things.
Your husband is doing this, your kids are doing that, you're flustered, and you've got to go into a session with a client. What do you do to be present?
I have the answer that I would like to give you, and then I have the truth, right? Because I would like to say, you know, I do some either like some mindfulness meditation or I do like a yoga stretch. And sometimes that happens. More often than not, though, my life is scheduled, and this is something I'm trying to work on, so closely together from life to client meetings to whatever that I don't have a lot of space, right, for re-regulation. And in those moments, I think I have to say to myself, I get to do this. I get to be with clients. I get to do the work that I do, or I get to be with my kids, even though they're driving me a little nutty and I don't want to be with them in that moment, right? I think the gratitude piece is a quick way to say, you know what? I know this is hard and you're exhausted and this is not ideal, but in another universe, this wouldn't be your life and you wouldn't have the ability to do this. And at the end of the day, I love this work so much that that's enough to be like, you know what? I get to do this.
It's a reframing. I do the same thing, by the way, when I'm like, gratitude is a big one for me in terms of a reframe, you know? So I appreciate that. All right. One more on this. So it's like best day ever. You know, you're calm, content, tranquil, peaceful. What brings you to that place?
Ooh. When I've made space to actually live. And it's hard to do that. I mean, you know, between the meetings and the this and that and the work and life, I think when I feel like I'm in the flow is when I've blocked out days in my schedule where I say, I'm not working today. Or I'm going to do this thing that I've been wanting to craft, because crafting is one of my like, you know, stress relievers. And so it's like, I've been thinking about this project of something I want to make and I actually get to go and do it. Right. And so I would say, yeah, it's the ability to do that, to make space, to be intentional about it and to live, to really live and like know that you're living versus autopilot. I'm just running from thing to thing.
Last question.
Okay.
We're going to imagine a world where everyone has healthy strategies that work for them to deal with their emotions, to deal with their feelings. Just take a moment and imagine that world. What do you see that's different about that world?
I'm going to keep my eyes closed because it's helping me visualize what I see, but I see so much compassion between people. And I see grace being extended between people. And I see healthy resolution of conflict that actually brings people deeper into relationship with each other. I see a lot more peace, right, in the world, in the ways that we be with each other, I think, I see a utopia, if you could say it that way, right? Because if we can figure out those things between people, then we can solve world problems, right? But if we can't be in relation with one another in groundedness and emotional regulation, then how do we solve even the simplest of problems?
That's beautiful. Thank you. It reminds me of in your book, how and I was, it was new for me to read in terms of your concept of permission to come home. Like, what does that really, really mean? And I think a lot of what it's this place of where I feel held, and where there's no judgment, where it is just the sense of freedom. And so, why is that the title?
I knew this was the title even before the book came together in its pieces and chapters. I think in our culture, there's a lot of permission seeking, right? And a lot of times we're so interconnected that we care a lot about what the people around us think and feel and hope and dream for us. And so we ask, can I do this? Can I love this person? Can this be my career? There's so much of that. And I think I wanted to give people the permission to also think that they could claim permission for themselves in a lot of these spaces, And then I think being an immigrant, I don't really feel at home anywhere. I just came back from Taiwan, which is our ancestral homeland. But I did not feel at home there either, And so I think as an immigrant, we live in these marginal spaces because of society and how it chooses to view us. And so I feel like we're constantly seeking a home. And so I wanted to impart this idea that home is a state of being. It is a belief that I am valued and I'm held and I'm safe, right? And that we as a society and communally can co-create that together.
So what is your request for people? What are you hoping that people learn from all of this work you've been doing?
My hope is that people will move away from the possible feelings of shame that surround mental health, struggle, emotional, right, pain, and realize that when we enter into that pain, we find healing, we find growth, we find connection with others. And I think culturally, our instinctual response is to run from that pain, is to say, don't even acknowledge it, pretend it's not there. And I want to invite people into realizing that, in fact, it's not shameful to go there. It is necessary. And your life depends on it. Our world depends on it, right? Because the more healed each of us can move towards, right, in that place, I think the better the world will be in the end.
I want to make sure that people know how to reach you and learn about you and your work. So can you just share with us the best way for people to do that?
Sure. I would say, I guess Instagram is a very popular way to get in touch. So I'm at Asians for Mental Health. And you can find me on Facebook as well as Instagram. And then you can also reach me at my website, jennywangphd.com, and reach out there.
Thank you again, Jenny. It was great to have you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Jenny Wang. My big take-home message was that we need to become scientists about the ways we were raised. We need to ask ourselves which aspects of our culture are helping us and which aspects might be getting in the way of our own well-being. I'm still thinking about that in relation to my own upbringing. Let me know down below in the comments section your thoughts about the episode. I'm really interested in learning how you see your own cultural background being helpful or not, and how you deal with your feelings. And if you enjoyed the episode, I want to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, share the episode with your friends and family, and please follow me on social media for additional tips and strategies. I'm super glad to have you on this Dealing with Feeling journey, along with me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.